The helicopter blades sliced through the thick Afghan air like a mechanical prayer, each rotation bringing them closer to what command had described as a routine extraction. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos pressed her medical kit closer to her chest, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being the team's medic. Her brown eyes scanned the horizon through the aircraft's open door, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of amber and crimson. She had done this dance 100 times before, but something about today felt different. 2 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. Maria glanced at her team. There was Lieutenant Colonel James Hawk Morrison, their commanding officer, whose steel-gray eyes had seen too many wars. Sergeant First Class Danny Rodriguez sat across from her, methodically checking his rifle for the third time. Next to him, Corporal Mike Tank Williams cleaned his glasses with the kind of precision that came from years of needing perfect vision to keep his brothers alive. And then there was Petty Officer First Class Alex Ghost Thompson, the quiet one who spoke more with his actions than his words. They were heading to retrieve what intelligence had classified as a high-value target, a female civilian who had been providing crucial information about Taliban movements in the region. The woman had gone dark 3 days ago, and satellite imagery had picked up her emergency beacon from a remote village that had recently been the site of heavy fighting. Remember, this is supposed to be a milk run. Hawk's voice cut through the engine noise. We go in, grab the package, and get out. But stay sharp. Intel's been spotty in this sector. Maria nodded, her fingers unconsciously checking the medical supplies one more time. Morphine, gauze, tourniquets for bags, everything she might need to keep someone alive long enough to get them home. She had learned early in her career that preparation was the difference between bringing soldiers home and sending letters to their families. The helicopter began its descent, and Maria could see the village below. It looked peaceful enough, a collection of mud brick houses scattered across a valley floor, surrounded by terrace fields that had once been green but now bore the brown scars of conflict. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, suggesting that life continued here despite the war that raged around it. LZ is cold, the pilot reported, setting down in 30 seconds. As the aircraft touched down, dust swirled around them like a miniature sandstorm. The team moved with practiced efficiency, each member knowing their role without need for verbal coordination. They had worked together for 2 years, through missions that had taken them from the mountains of Afghanistan to the deserts of Iraq, and they moved like parts of a single organism. The village elder, a weathered man with kind eyes and a carefully trimmed beard, approached them with his hands visible. Through their interpreter, he explained that the woman they sought was in a house at the far end of the village. She had been brought there 3 nights ago by fighters who had found her wandering in the mountains, apparently suffering from exposure and trauma. She has not spoken since she arrived, the elder said through the translator. The women of her village have cared for her, but she seems to be somewhere else in her mind. Maria felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She had seen this before, the 1,000-yard stare that came from witnessing things that broke something fundamental in the human spirit. Combat stress, they called it clinically, but Maria knew it was really the soul's way of protecting itself when reality became too much to bear. The house they were led to was small and simple, with thick walls designed to keep out both the desert heat and the mountain cold. As they approached, Maria could hear the soft murmur of women's voices inside. The elder knocked gently and spoke in Pashto. After a moment, an older woman appeared in the doorway. Her face was lined with the kind of worry that came from mothering children in a war zone. Through the interpreter, she explained that the woman had been found wearing torn clothing and bearing signs of having traveled for days through rough terrain. She had been dehydrated and malnourished when she arrived, but physically she was healing. Emotionally, however, she remained locked away from the world. She wakes screaming sometimes, the woman said, her voice heavy with concern. But during the day, she sits by the window and stares at nothing. We have tried to feed her, to comfort her, but she responds to nothing. Hawk gestured for Maria to take the lead. As the team's medic, She was often the first point of contact with civilians who had been traumatized. She had a gentleness about her that put people at ease, even in the midst of chaos. It was one of the reasons she had been specifically requested for this mission. Maria stepped into the dim interior of the house, allowing her eyes to adjust to the light. The room was simple but clean, with colorful rugs covering the earthen floor and cushions arranged along the walls. In the far corner, near a small window that looked out onto the mountains, sat a figure that Maria's mind initially struggled to process. The woman was young, perhaps in her early 30s, with auburn hair that had been recently washed and braided by her caretakers. She wore traditional Afghan clothing, a long blue dress, and matching headscarf, but something about the way she held herself suggested these were not her usual garments. Her skin was pale, suggesting she was not local to this region, and her hands, while showing recent cuts and scrapes, bore the calluses of someone accustomed to physical work. But it was her eyes that stopped Maria cold. They were green, the color of deep forest pools, and they held a depth of pain that spoke of experiences far beyond what any civilian should endure. As Maria approached, the woman's gaze shifted to meet hers, and, for a moment, Maria felt as though she was looking into the eyes of a fellow warrior. "Mom," Maria said softly, kneeling down to bring herself to the woman's eye level. "My name is Maria Santos. I'm with the United States Army. We're here to take you home." The woman's expression didn't change, but Maria noticed something, a slight shift in posture, a barely perceptible straightening of the shoulders that suggested military bearing. It was subtle, so subtle that someone without military training might have missed it entirely, but Maria had spent enough time around soldiers to recognize the signs. She tried again, this time speaking in the careful, measured tone she used with traumatized soldiers. "Can you tell me your name? We're here to help you." Still no response, but Maria caught something else. The woman's eyes had briefly flicked to Maria's medical kit, and in that glance was a familiarity that suggested knowledge of military equipment. Maria's pulse quickened as pieces of a puzzle began to shift in her mind. "Hawk," Maria called softly, not wanting to startle their charge. "I need to speak with you." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison approached quietly. He had learned to trust Maria's instincts when it came to reading people, and the tone in her voice suggested she had picked up on something important. "What is it, Santos?" he asked in a low voice. "Sir, I don't think she's a civilian." Maria kept her voice barely above a whisper. "The way she carries herself, the way she looked at my kit, something's not right about the intel we received." Hawk studied the woman more carefully. Like Maria, he had spent years around military personnel, and now that his attention was focused, he began to see what Maria had noticed. The woman sat with a straight back despite her obvious exhaustion. Her hands were positioned in a way that suggested she was unconsciously ready to defend herself or move quickly if necessary. Most tellingly, her eyes continued to track the movements of everyone in the room with the kind of situational awareness that was trained, not natural. "Rodriguez," Hawk called quietly, "run a check on our intel package. See if there's anything we might have missed." As Rodriguez began working his radio, Maria attempted once more to connect with the woman. This time, she decided to try a different approach. Instead of speaking as a medic to a civilian, she would speak as one soldier to another. "I don't know what happened to you out there," Maria said, her voice carrying the weight of shared understanding. "But I know that look. I've seen it in the mirror myself after bad missions. You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." For the first time, the woman's expression changed slightly. Her eyes focused more clearly on Maria's face, and there was a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or hope. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she raised her right hand slowly, and Maria's breath caught in her throat. The woman was attempting to salute. The movement was weak and incomplete, but unmistakable. Maria felt her world shift as the implications hit her. This wasn't a civilian informant. This was a soldier, a fellow warrior who had been through something so traumatic that it had stolen her voice and nearly broken her mind. "Jesus," Hawk breathed, having witnessed the attempted salute. Santos, check her for dog tags or any other identification. Maria approached carefully, aware that she was dealing with someone who might react with trained combat responses despite her current state. I'm going to check for identification, she said clearly. Is that okay? The woman nodded slightly, and Maria began a careful examination. Hidden beneath the traditional Afghan clothing, she found what she was looking for, a thin chain around the woman's neck. With gentle hands, she lifted the chain, revealing not one, but 2 sets of military dog tags. The first set made Maria's blood run cold. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy. Blood type O-negative. The second set was different, older, more worn. When Maria read the name, she felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet. Huck, you need to see this right now. The tags belonged to Petty Officer First Class David Mitchell, United States Navy, killed in action in Iraq 3 years prior. Maria's mind raced as she processed the information. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just any sailor. She was military family, someone who had already paid a price for her service through loss. But there was something else that made Maria's hands tremble as she held the tags. The dates and unit information suggested that Sarah Mitchell wasn't just Navy. She was Special Operations. The kind of soldier who went places and did things that never made it into official reports. Rodriguez, what did you find on that intel check? Hawk's voice carried a new urgency. Sir, that's just it. There's almost nothing here. The whole package is classified so far above our pay grade that I can't even access the basic information. All I'm getting is that she's a strategic asset, and that extraction is priority 1. Maria looked down at the woman, at Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, and felt a surge of protective anger. Whatever had happened to her out there, it had been bad enough to reduce a trained special operations sailor to this broken state. The fact that her existence was buried so deep in classification suggested that she had been operating in the darkest corners of the War on Terror. Lieutenant Mitchell, Maria said, using her rank for the first time. Can you hear me? You're with friendly forces now. We're going to take you home. Sarah's eyes focused on Maria's face with what seemed like tremendous effort. Her mouth moved again, and this time a whisper of sound emerged, so quiet that Maria had to lean in close to hear it. Can't remember home. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. She had seen soldiers struggle with the transition back to civilian life, had treated men and women whose minds bore invisible wounds that were harder to heal than any physical injury. But there was something in Sarah's voice that suggested a deeper trauma, not just the difficulty of readjustment, but a fundamental disconnection from her own identity. We'll help you remember, Maria promised, her voice thick with emotion. One step at a time, we'll help you find your way back. As the team prepared for extraction, Maria remained close to Sarah, talking quietly to her about simple things, the weather, the helicopter waiting for them, the flight back to base. She noticed that Sarah responded better to direct, honest communication than to attempts at comfort or reassurance. It reinforced Maria's growing certainty that they were dealing with someone who had been trained to compartmentalize emotion and focus on mission requirements. The helicopter ride back to base passed in relative silence. Sarah sat between Maria and Ghost, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. Occasionally, she would flinch at the sound of the rotors or tense when the aircraft banked sharply, but for the most part, she remained still and quiet. Maria found herself studying Sarah's face, trying to piece together the story of what had brought a Navy Special Operations sailor to a remote Afghan village in such a broken state. The physical signs told part of the tale. Healing cuts and bruises suggested she had been in some kind of firefight or accident. The deeper trauma was less obvious but more concerning. This was someone whose mind had been pushed beyond its limits and had responded by shutting down non-essential functions, including the ability to communicate effectively. As they approached the base, Maria made a decision that would change the course of her military career. Instead of simply handing Sarah over to the intelligence officers who would certainly want to debrief her, Maria was going to ensure that this wounded warrior received the medical and psychological care she needed to heal. Whatever secrets Sarah Mitchell carried, whatever classified operations had led her to that village, Maria was determined that the woman would not become another casualty of a system that sometimes forgot that even the most elite soldiers were human beings who could be broken and who deserved the chance to be made whole again. The helicopter touched down at the forward operating base as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. As they helped Sarah from the aircraft, Maria caught sight of several officers approaching. Men in uniforms without unit patches, the kind of people who dealt in secrets and shadows. Maria positioned herself between Sarah and the approaching officers, her medical kit in one hand, and her other hand gently guiding Sarah toward the medical facility. Whatever happened next, she was going to make sure that Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell received the care she deserved as both a wounded warrior and a human being who had given everything in service to her country. The real battle, Maria realized, was just beginning. The medical facility at Forward Operating Base Chapman hummed with the controlled chaos that Maria Santos had grown accustomed to over her 3 deployments. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the ever-present dust that managed to infiltrate even the most secure buildings, creating an atmosphere that was sterile, yet somehow still touched by the raw reality of war. As she guided Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell through the entrance, Maria felt the weight of eyes following them. Word traveled fast on a base, and the arrival of a mysterious woman in traditional Afghan clothing had already sparked curiosity among the personnel. Bay 3 is open, called Sergeant Lisa Chun, the night shift nurse who had worked alongside Maria on countless difficult cases. Chin's expression shifted from routine professionalism to concern as she took in Sarah's appearance and Maria's protective posture. "What do we have?" "Possible combat stress reaction. Severe," Maria replied, using the clinical language that would keep the curious at bay while ensuring Sarah received appropriate care. "Patient exhibits signs of dissociative episodes and selective mutism. I need a private room and a full trauma workup." Chin nodded and quickly led them to a small private room at the back of the facility, away from the main treatment areas where other soldiers might overhear. As they walked, Maria noticed how Sarah moved. There was still that underlying military bearing despite her obvious trauma, a muscle memory that kept her back straight, and her head up even when her mind seemed to be somewhere else entirely. The room was small but clean, with a single bed, a chair, and a small table. Medical equipment lined one wall, and a window looked out onto the base's central courtyard. Maria helped Sarah sit on the edge of the bed, noting how the woman's eyes immediately began cataloging the room's contents: exits, potential weapons, defensive positions. Even in her traumatized state, Sarah's tactical training remained intact. "Sarah," Maria said gently, using her first name to try to establish a more personal connection. "I'm going to examine you now, okay? Just routine medical checks to make sure you're healing properly." Sarah's green eyes focused on Maria's face with what seemed like tremendous effort. She nodded once, a small gesture, but more response than she had shown since they found her in the village. As Maria began her examination, she discovered evidence that painted a disturbing picture of what Sarah had endured. Beyond the healing cuts and bruises she had noticed earlier, there were older scars that spoke of previous injuries sustained in combat situations. A faded bullet wound on her left shoulder, surgical scars on her abdomen, and, most telling of all, a series of small, precise scars on her hands and forearms that Maria recognized from her training in battlefield medicine. Torture scars. Maria's stomach clenched as the implications became clear. Sarah Mitchell hadn't just been through a difficult mission. She had been captured and tortured before somehow escaping or being freed. The fact that she had survived such an ordeal and still made it to that remote village spoke to both incredible physical toughness and mental resilience, but it also explained the severity of her current psychological state. "Chun," Maria called quietly, "I need you to run a tox screen and check for any signs of chemical intervention." Lisa Chin's eyebrows raised at the request, but she moved to draw blood samples without question. In their line of work, they had learned not to ask too many questions when a colleague's medical instinct suggested something serious. As Chun worked, Maria noticed that Sarah was watching the procedure with intense focus. Her eyes tracked every movement, every piece of equipment, with the kind of hypervigilance that came from having been in situations where missing a detail could mean the difference between life and death. "You're safe here," Maria said quietly, continuing to speak even though Sarah remained silent. "This is a U.S. military base. You're among friends." Sarah's gaze shifted to Maria's face, and for a moment, there was something almost like recognition there. Her lips moved slightly, and Maria leaned closer to hear. "How long?" The words were barely audible, but they were clearly spoken. "How long have you been missing?" Maria asked. Sarah nodded slightly. "According to our intelligence, about 3 days. But you might have been out there longer than that." Sarah's expression became troubled, and she raised one shaking hand to her temple. The gesture was one Maria had seen many times before, the look of someone trying to grasp memories that remained frustratingly just out of reach. "It's okay if you can't remember everything right now," Maria assured her. "That's normal after trauma. The memories will come back when your mind is ready to handle them." A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Maria looked up to see Lieutenant Colonel Morrison standing in the doorway, his expression grave. Behind him stood a man in civilian clothes, khakis, and a polo shirt that screamed intelligence officer to anyone with military experience. "Santos, I need to speak with you," Hawk said carefully. Maria glanced at Sarah, who had gone rigid at the sight of the stranger. The woman's tactical instincts were clearly still functioning, and she had identified the civilian as a potential threat. "Can it wait?" Maria asked, not wanting to leave Sarah alone with her obvious distress. "I'm afraid not," the civilian said, stepping forward. "I'm Agent David Coleman, Defense Intelligence Agency. I need to debrief Lieutenant Mitchell immediately." Maria felt her protective instincts flare. "Sir, with respect, Lieutenant Mitchell is in no condition to be debriefed right now. She needs medical attention and time to process her trauma." Coleman's expression hardened slightly. "Staff Sergeant, you don't understand the sensitivity of this situation. Lieutenant Mitchell was involved in a classified operation that has significant implications for ongoing missions in this theater. Any intelligence she possesses could be time-critical. And you don't understand that pushing a trauma victim too hard, too fast can cause permanent psychological damage." Maria shot back. "She's been tortured, sir. Whatever operation she was involved in, it went bad enough that she's barely functional. Give her time to heal." Sarah had been watching this exchange with growing agitation. Her breathing had quickened, and Maria could see her hands beginning to shake. The woman was clearly triggering on something. Whether it was the presence of the intelligence officer or the discussion of her mission, Maria couldn't tell. "Hey," Maria said, turning back to Sarah and deliberately blocking Coleman from her line of sight. "Stay with me. You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you." But Sarah's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her eyes had taken on a glassy quality, and she was beginning to hyperventilate. Maria recognized the signs of a panic attack brought on by traumatic stress. "Everyone out," Maria ordered. "Now." "Staff Sergeant, I don't think you understand," Coleman began. "Out." Maria's voice carried the authority of someone who had made life and death decisions under fire. "This is a medical emergency." Hawk grabbed Coleman's arm and guided him from the room, leaving Maria alone with Sarah. The woman was now in full panic mode, her breathing shallow and rapid, her body trembling with the kind of terror that came from reliving whatever horrors she had experienced during her captivity. Maria moved carefully, not wanting to trigger Sarah's defensive reflexes. She had dealt with enough combat veterans to know that someone in the midst of a trauma-induced panic attack could react violently if they felt cornered or threatened. "Sarah, listen to my voice," Maria said in the calm, steady tone she used to talk soldiers through medical procedures. "You're having a panic attack. It feels scary, but you're not in danger. Just focus on my voice and try to slow your breathing. Sarah's eyes locked onto Maria's face like a lifeline. Maria could see the woman fighting against whatever memories were threatening to overwhelm her, struggling to stay connected to the present moment. That's good. You're doing great, Maria encouraged. Now I want you to breathe with me. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. Can you do that? Slowly, gradually, Sarah's breathing began to regulate. The color returned to her face, and the terrible trembling began to subside. As the panic attack faded, she slumped forward, exhausted by the effort of fighting her own mind. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words so quiet that Maria had a strain to hear them. "You have nothing to apologize for," Maria replied firmly. "What you're experiencing is a normal response to abnormal circumstances. You survived something terrible, and your mind is trying to protect you the only way it knows how." Sarah looked up at Maria with eyes that held a depth of pain that was almost unbearable to witness. I can't remember what happened. I know something bad, but the details are gone," Maria suggested gently. Sarah nodded. "It's like looking at shadows on a wall. I know something's there, but I can't make out what it is." Maria had seen this before in soldiers who had experienced severe trauma. The mind's defense mechanism was to bury memories too painful to process, locking them away until the person was strong enough to deal with them. In some cases, those memories never returned. In others, they came back all at once in a flood that could be overwhelming. "The memories may come back, or they may not," Maria said honestly. "Right now, the most important thing is getting you physically and emotionally stable. Everything else can wait." Over the next several hours, Maria worked to establish a basic medical baseline for Sarah. The blood work revealed traces of several drugs in her system, some that she recognized as interrogation aids, others that were unfamiliar but clearly pharmaceutical in nature. The combination suggested that Sarah's captors had used chemical methods to try to extract information from her. As the night wore on, Maria began to piece together fragments of Sarah's story. Through careful, gentle questioning, she learned that Sarah was part of a Navy SEAL team that had been conducting deep reconnaissance in Taliban-controlled territory. The mission had been classified at the highest levels, involving intelligence gathering on a suspected terrorist leader who was believed to be planning attacks on American forces. "We were supposed to be there for 3 days," Sarah said during one of her more lucid moments. "Observation only. No engagement unless absolutely necessary." "What went wrong?" Maria asked. Sarah's expression became troubled again. I remember gunfire, an explosion, someone screaming." She paused, her hands unconsciously clenching into fists. "After that, it's mostly blank until I woke up in that cell." The word cell hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Maria could see that even speaking about it was difficult for Sarah, but she also sensed that the woman needed to get some of it out to start the process of reclaiming her own story. "How long were you held?" Maria asked carefully. "I don't know. Days? Weeks?" Time didn't work right there. Sarah's voice became distant. "They kept the lights on all the time or off all the time. I couldn't tell if it was day or night." Maria felt a surge of anger at what had been done to this woman. Sleep deprivation was a common torture technique, designed to break down a person's mental defenses and make them more susceptible to interrogation. Combined with the drugs they had found in her system, it painted a picture of systematic psychological warfare designed to destroy Sarah's ability to resist. "Did you give them anything?" Maria asked, knowing it was a question that would torment Sarah regardless of the answer. Sarah's face crumpled with shame. I tried not to. I really tried. But after a while, I couldn't think straight. I couldn't remember what was real and what wasn't." She looked up at Maria with desperate eyes. "Did I betray my team? Did I get people killed?" "Listen to me," Maria said firmly, leaning forward to make sure Sarah was looking directly at her. "Whatever you may have said under torture doesn't define you as a soldier or as a person. You survived something that would have broken most people completely. The fact that you're sitting here talking to me right now proves that they didn't break you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the first emotional response Maria had seen from her that wasn't pure terror. "But What if nothing? Maria interrupted. You are a United States Navy SEAL. You took an oath to defend your country, and you've clearly given everything in service of that oath. Whatever happened in that cell, you did your best to resist, and you survived. That's what matters now. As dawn broke over the base, Maria realized that she had spent the entire night with Sarah, talking her through panic attacks, helping her eat small amounts of food, and simply being present as she began the long process of healing. It was well beyond her normal duties as a medic, but Maria had recognized something in Sarah that demanded her attention, a fellow warrior who needed to know she wasn't fighting this battle alone. Agent Coleman returned around 0800, accompanied by a full-bird colonel that Maria didn't recognize. Their presence brought immediate tension to the room, and Maria could see Sarah beginning to withdraw again. Staff Sergeant Santos, the colonel said, I'm Colonel Williams, base medical officer. Agent Coleman has expressed concerns about the delay in debriefing Lieutenant Mitchell. Sir, my medical opinion is that Lieutenant Mitchell is not ready for a formal debriefing, Maria replied. She's exhibiting classic symptoms of severe PTSD, including memory fragmentation and dissociative episodes. Pushing her too hard right now could cause permanent psychological damage. Colonel Williams studied Sarah for a moment, taking in her obvious distress at the presence of strangers. What do you recommend? Time, sir. Gradual reintegration. Let her tell her story when she's ready, not when it's convenient for intelligence purposes. Coleman stepped forward. Colonel, with respect, we don't have the luxury of time. Lieutenant Mitchell's mission compromised several ongoing operations. We need to know what information she may have given to her captors so we can take appropriate countermeasures. Sarah's breathing began to quicken again at the word captors, and Maria moved to position herself between Sarah and the intelligence officer. She doesn't remember most of what happened, Maria said, and what she does remember comes in fragments that may or may not be accurate. Any intelligence you get from her right now would be unreliable at best. That's for us to determine, Coleman replied curtly. Actually, it's for me to determine, Colonel Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. This is a medical facility, and Lieutenant Mitchell is my patient. Agent Coleman, you'll have your debriefing, but it will be conducted according to medical protocols and at a pace that doesn't compromise the patient's recovery. Coleman's face reddened slightly, but he nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. But I want daily updates on her condition and the first opportunity to speak with her when she's cleared for questioning. After the intelligence officer left, Colonel Williams turned to Maria. Santos, you've done excellent work here. I'm assigning you as Lieutenant Mitchell's primary care provider. I want daily reports on her progress, and I want your recommendation before we allow any formal debriefing. Maria felt a mixture of relief and responsibility settle over her. Sarah Mitchell had been placed in her care, and she was determined to see the woman through whatever dark valley she was walking. As a fellow service member, as a medic, and as a human being who had witnessed too much suffering, Maria knew that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. As the morning progressed, Maria began to understand that Sarah's recovery would be unlike anything she had dealt with before. This wasn't just a matter of treating physical wounds or even typical combat stress. Sarah had been systematically broken down by experts in psychological warfare, and rebuilding her would require patience, skill, and a level of personal commitment that went far beyond normal medical care. But as she watched Sarah sleep peacefully for the first time since they had found her, Maria knew that she was exactly where she needed to be. Some people were worth fighting for, and Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell was definitely one of them. 2 weeks into Sarah Mitchell's recovery, Maria Santos had established a routine that felt almost normal despite the extraordinary circumstances. Each morning at 0600, she would enter the private room that had become Sarah's sanctuary within the medical facility, carrying 2 cups of coffee and whatever breakfast she had managed to procure from the mess hall. Sarah was always awake when she arrived. Maria suspected the woman rarely slept more than a few hours at a time, but She had stopped mentioning the nightmares that clearly plagued her. The transformation in Sarah during those 14 days had been remarkable, yet incomplete. Physically, she was healing well. The cuts and bruises had faded, and she had gained back some of the weight she had lost during her captivity. Mentally, however, the progress was slower and more complex. Some days, Sarah seemed almost like her old self, alert, engaged, asking intelligent questions about current events and base operations. Other days, she would retreat so far into herself that Maria wondered if she was even aware of the outside world. "How are you feeling this morning?" Maria asked as she set down the coffee cups and pulled up her usual chair beside Sarah's bed. Sarah was sitting by the window, as she did every morning, watching the sunrise paint the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and purple. She had dressed herself in the military clothing that Maria had requisitioned for her, BDU pants and a navy t-shirt that somehow made her look both more like herself and more fragile at the same time. "Better," Sarah replied, though Maria had learned to interpret the subtle variations in that standard response. Today's "better" carried more weight than yesterday's. There was a clarity in Sarah's green eyes that had been absent for several days. "Do you want to try going outside today?" Maria asked. It was a question she had been asking for a week, and Sarah had consistently declined, preferring the safety of her controlled environment. To Maria's surprise, Sarah nodded slowly. "Maybe, just for a few minutes." It was a significant step forward. Sarah had shown little interest in venturing beyond the medical facility, and Maria understood why. Out there were too many variables, too many things that could trigger memories she wasn't ready to face. But the willingness to try suggested that some part of Sarah was beginning to trust that the world outside her room might be safe. "We'll take it slow," Maria assured her. "Just to the courtyard. If you want to come back inside, we come back inside. No questions asked." As they prepared for their brief excursion, Maria reflected on what she had learned about Sarah during their daily conversations. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell was 28 years old, originally from San Diego, and had joined the Navy immediately after college. She had lost her younger brother David in Iraq 3 years earlier, the owner of the second set of dog tags she wore around her neck. David had been her inspiration to pursue special operations, wanting to honor his memory by serving in the most dangerous and important missions her country could offer. Sarah had been deployed 4 times in 6 years, twice to Afghanistan and twice to Iraq. She had participated in more classified operations than most soldiers saw in an entire career, and her personnel file, which Maria had been given limited access to, read like a catalog of exemplary service, commendations, successful mission completions, and the respect of her peers painted a picture of a soldier who had been at the top of her profession. The contrast between that accomplished warrior and the fragile woman who sometimes couldn't remember how to tie her shoes was heartbreaking. But Maria had also begun to see glimpses of the person Sarah had been before her capture. Moments of sharp intelligence, tactical awareness, and a dry sense of humor that suggested her spirit, while wounded, was far from broken. They made their way slowly through the medical facility and out into the courtyard that formed the center of the base. It was still early enough that foot traffic was light, and Maria had deliberately chosen a route that would minimize encounters with other personnel. Sarah walked close beside her, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings with the hypervigilance that had become second nature. The courtyard was peaceful in the morning light. A few off-duty soldiers sat on benches reading or writing letters home. The sound of helicopters in the distance provided a constant background hum that was somehow reassuring rather than threatening. The sound of American military power that meant safety for those within its protection. "It's strange," Sarah said after they had been sitting on a bench for several minutes, "being able to sit outside without watching for snipers or IEDs." It was the first time she had made any reference to tactical considerations without prompting, and Maria took it as another positive sign. "That's what we're here for," she replied. "So you can sit in the sun without worrying about anything more dangerous than getting a sunburn." Sarah smiled slightly, a real smile, not the careful expression she usually wore when trying to convince Maria she was feeling better than she actually was. I'd forgotten what that felt like. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the life of the base continue around them. Sarah seemed to be absorbing the normalcy of it all. Soldiers going about their duties, maintenance crews working on vehicles, the ordinary business of military life continuing despite the war raging beyond the base's protective walls. "Maria," Sarah said suddenly, using her first name for only the second time since they had met. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why are you doing this?" Sarah's voice carried genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. "I mean, going above and beyond like this. You could have handed me over to the intelligence people and been done with it." Maria considered the question carefully. It was something she had asked herself more than once over the past 2 weeks. "Because you remind me of why I became a medic in the first place," she said finally. "My job isn't just to treat wounds or hand out medications. It's to help people heal, the whole person, not just the injured parts." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Your brother," she said, catching Maria off guard. "My brother? You mentioned him once when you were talking me through a panic attack. You said something about wishing someone had been there for him when he needed help." Maria felt her throat tighten. She had indeed mentioned Miguel during one of Sarah's worst nights, when the woman had been convinced that she was still in captivity and that Maria was part of some elaborate psychological torture. In her desperation to break through Sarah's terror, Maria had shared the story of her younger brother's suicide after his return from his second deployment to Afghanistan. "He came back different," Maria said quietly. "Angry, paranoid, couldn't sleep. The doctor said it was adjustment disorder, gave him some pills, and sent him on his way. 6 months later, he was dead." Sarah was watching her intently now, and Maria could see understanding dawning in her eyes. "That's why you fight so hard for your patients. Every soldier who comes through that medical facility is somebody's brother, sister, son, or daughter," Maria replied. "They all deserve better than Miguel got." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Agent Coleman, accompanied by the same colonel from earlier and another man in civilian clothes that Maria didn't recognize. Sarah immediately tensed, her body language shifting to a defensive posture that was barely perceptible but unmistakable to someone who had been watching her closely. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Coleman said as the group approached their bench. "Good to see you're feeling well enough to be outside. I'm hoping that means you're ready to discuss your mission." Maria felt Sarah's breathing quicken and reached out to place a steady hand on her arm. "Agent Coleman, we discussed this with Colonel Williams. Any formal debriefing needs to be cleared through medical first." "Actually, Staff Sergeant, that's why I'm here," the new civilian said, stepping forward. "I'm Dr. James Wright, military psychologist. I've been asked to evaluate Lieutenant Mitchell's readiness for questioning." Maria studied the man carefully. Dr. Wright appeared to be in his 50s, with the kind of soft appearance that suggested he spent more time behind a desk than in field conditions. His manner was professional, but distant, and Maria instinctively distrusted anyone who treated soldiers like case studies rather than human beings. "Sarah," Maria said, deliberately using her first name to reinforce the personal connection they had built. "Do you feel ready to talk about your mission?" Sarah's eyes darted between the faces surrounding her, and Maria could see her beginning to withdraw. The confident woman who had been willing to sit outside and enjoy the sunrise was disappearing, replaced by the frightened, fragile person who had been brought to them 2 weeks earlier. I don't know," Sarah said, her voice becoming smaller. "I still can't remember most of it." Dr. Wright pulled out a small recording device and sat on the bench between them. "That's quite all right, Lieutenant. Sometimes memories can be recovered through guided conversation. Why don't we start with what you do remember about the beginning of your mission?" The sight of the recording device had an immediate and dramatic effect on Sarah. Her face went pale, and she began to shake uncontrollably. Maria recognized the signs of an impending panic attack and moved quickly to position herself between Sarah and the psychologist. "Turn that off," she ordered. "Now!" "Staff Sergeant," I don't think you understand the importance, Dr. Wright began. Turn it off, or I'm taking my patient back inside, Maria said firmly. She's obviously not ready for this. Sarah was hyperventilating now, her eyes fixed on the recording device with the kind of terror that suggested it was triggering specific memories from her captivity. Maria had seen enough trauma cases to know that certain objects or situations could serve as powerful triggers, instantly transporting a victim back to their worst moments. "Sarah, look at me," Maria commanded, using her most authoritative voice to cut through the panic. "You're safe. You're on an American military base. No one is going to hurt you." But Sarah was beyond hearing her. She was mumbling something under her breath, words that Maria couldn't quite make out, but that carried the tone of someone pleading for mercy. The sight of a Navy SEAL, one of the most elite warriors in the American military, reduced to this state of terror, was almost too painful to witness. "That's enough," Maria declared, scooping up the recording device and switching it off. "This interview is over," Dr. Wright protested, but Colonel Williams, who had been observing the entire interaction, held up a hand to silence him. "Staff Sergeant Santos is right. Lieutenant Mitchell is clearly not ready for formal questioning." As they helped Sarah back to the medical facility, Maria felt a surge of protective anger toward the people who were more concerned with extracting intelligence than with healing a wounded warrior. She understood the military necessity of debriefing, but she also knew that pushing too hard too fast could permanently damage someone who was already hanging on a sanity by the thinnest of threads. Back in her room, Sarah slowly began to calm down. Maria sat with her, talking quietly about inconsequential things until the panic subsided and Sarah's breathing returned to normal. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered when she was finally able to speak coherently again. "You have nothing to apologize for," Maria replied firmly. "What happened out there was not your fault. They pushed too hard too fast." Sarah looked up at her with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and shame. "I used to be stronger than this. I used to be someone who could handle anything." "You are still that person," Maria assured her. "Strength doesn't mean being unaffected by trauma. It means surviving it and working to heal from it. That's exactly what you're doing." Over the remainder of that day, Maria began to understand that Sarah's recovery was going to be far more complicated than she had initially realized. The woman wasn't just dealing with general trauma from captivity. She was carrying specific triggers and associations that would need to be carefully identified and worked through. The recording device had clearly reminded her of interrogation sessions during her captivity. The presence of multiple authority figures had triggered her defensive responses. Even seemingly innocent questions about her mission were enough to send her spiraling back into the helpless state she had been in when they first found her. That evening, as Maria was completing her daily reports, Colonel Williams stopped by her desk. "How is she really doing, Santos?" he asked, settling into a nearby chair. "Better than when we found her, sir, but she's got a long way to go," Maria replied honestly. "Today proved that we need to be very careful about how we approach her recovery. Pushing too hard could undo weeks of progress. And the intelligence aspect." Maria chose her words carefully. "Sir, I think Lieutenant Mitchell wants to cooperate. But right now, asking her about her mission is like asking someone to voluntarily walk back into hell. We need to help her heal enough that she can face those memories without being destroyed by them." Colonel Williams nodded thoughtfully. "I've been getting pressure from higher up the chain. Apparently, Lieutenant Mitchell's mission was more significant than we were initially told. There are people in Washington who are very interested in what she might know. With respect, sir, the people in Washington aren't the ones who have to watch her shake like a leaf every time someone asks her a direct question about her captivity," Maria replied. "She's a human being, not just a repository of classified information." "I know that, Santos, and I'm going to do everything I can to protect her from being pushed beyond what she can handle. But you need to understand that eventually she's going to have to face whatever happened to her out there. The question is whether we can help her get strong enough to survive that process." As Maria walked back to check on Sarah one last time before ending her shift, she reflected on the delicate balance they were trying to maintain. On one side were the legitimate needs of national security and the importance of understanding what intelligence might have been compromised during Sarah's captivity. On the other side was a wounded warrior who deserved the chance to heal at her own pace, without being treated as nothing more than a source of information. She found Sarah sitting by her window again, staring out at the mountains that were now silhouetted against the star-filled Afghan sky. "Can't sleep?" Maria asked gently. "Too many dreams," Sarah replied without turning around. "Sometimes I can't tell if what I'm remembering actually happened or if my mind is making things up to fill in the blanks." Maria pulled up her chair and sat beside the bed. "That's normal after trauma. Your mind is trying to process experiences that were too overwhelming to handle at the time. Some of the memories might be accurate, some might be distorted, and some might be completely fabricated. Right now, it doesn't matter which is which." Sarah finally turned to look at her. "But it will matter, won't it, when they finally make me talk about it officially?" "When you're ready to talk about it," Maria corrected. "And by then, hopefully, you'll be strong enough to separate what really happened from what your mind created to protect you." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both women lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "Maria, thank you for fighting for me today. I don't think I could have handled it if you hadn't been there." "You don't have to thank me for doing my job," Maria replied. "But you're welcome anyway." As Maria finally headed back to her own quarters, she knew that the real test of Sarah's recovery was still to come. Eventually, the woman would have to confront whatever horrors she had experienced during her captivity. The question was whether they could help her build enough strength and resilience to survive that confrontation intact. What Maria didn't know was that Sarah's memories were already beginning to return piece by terrifying piece, and that the reckoning with her past was approaching faster than anyone realized. The scream that tore through the medical facility at 0347 hours sent Maria Santos bolting upright from her cot in the on-call room. She had been sleeping lightly, as she had every night for the past month, attuned to any sound that might indicate Sarah Mitchell was in distress. This wasn't the usual nightmare-induced cry that had become familiar. This was something primal and devastating, the sound of someone reliving unspeakable horror. Maria ran barefoot through the corridors, her medical training overriding any concern for protocol or propriety. She burst into Sarah's room to find the woman pressed against the far wall, her eyes wide with terror, speaking rapidly in what sounded like a mixture of English and Pashto. Sweat poured down her face, and her hands were pressed flat against the wall, as if she were trying to push through it to escape from something only she could see. "Sarah," Maria called softly, not wanting to startle her further. "It's Maria. You're safe. You're in the medical facility at FOB Chapman." But Sarah didn't seem to hear her. She was trapped in some internal nightmare, reliving memories that had apparently chosen this moment to break through the protective barriers her mind had constructed. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice taking on the quality of someone much younger and more vulnerable than the trained warrior Maria had come to know. "I don't know anything about the tunnel systems. I told you already. Please don't hurt me anymore." Maria's blood ran cold as she realized what she was witnessing. Sarah wasn't just having a nightmare. She was experiencing a full flashback, completely immersed in reliving her interrogation and torture. The woman's mind had transported her back to that cell, and she was experiencing every moment as if it were happening all over again. I can't breathe," Sarah gasped, and Maria could see that she was hyperventilating. "The water, please. I'll tell you what you want to know. Just make it stop." Maria approached slowly, her hands visible, and her voice calm despite the fury building in her chest at what had obviously been done to this woman. "Sarah, you're not in that place anymore. You're with me, Maria. You're safe. No one is going to hurt you." She reached out carefully and touched Sarah's shoulder. The contact seemed to partially break through the flashback, and Sarah's wild eyes focused on Maria's face. "Maria?" Sarah's voice was small and confused, like a child waking from a terrible dream. "Are you real? Or are you part of it too?" I'm real, Maria assured her, moving closer. You're having a flashback. The memories are coming back, but you're not there anymore. You're here with me, and you're safe. Sarah's breathing began to slow slightly, but Maria could see that she was still partially trapped in a memory. Her body was shaking violently, and her eyes kept darting to corners of the room as if she expected her captors to emerge from the shadows. They wanted to know about Operation Neptune, Sarah said suddenly, her voice becoming clearer as more of her consciousness returned to the present. About the tunnel networks we'd mapped, about which villages were supporting the resistance. Maria felt her stomach clench. Sarah was beginning to remember specific details from her interrogation, and the classified nature of what she was revealing meant that Maria was now in possession of information that could have serious implications. It's okay, Maria said, though she knew it was anything but okay. You're safe now. They can't hurt you anymore. Sarah looked at her with eyes that were becoming more lucid, but were filled with a terrible realization. I told them, didn't I? I gave them everything they wanted to know. The pain in Sarah's voice was almost unbearable. Maria had seen soldiers struggle with the shame of perceived failure before, but this was different. Sarah wasn't just dealing with the normal doubts that came after a mission went wrong. She was confronting the reality that she had been broken by her captors and had revealed information that could endanger other American forces. Listen to me, Maria said firmly, taking Sarah's hands in hers. Whatever you told them, it wasn't your choice. They tortured you until your mind couldn't resist anymore. That's not weakness. That's what torture is designed to do. It breaks down a person's ability to make rational decisions. Sarah pulled her hands away and wrapped her arms around herself. You don't understand. I'm a SEAL. We're trained to resist interrogation. We're supposed to be able to handle anything they throw at us. And how long did you resist? Maria asked. How many days or weeks did you hold out before they finally broke through? Sarah's expression became distant as she tried to piece together the fragmented timeline of her captivity. I don't know exactly. They kept me disoriented on purpose. But it felt like forever. That's because you're stronger than you think you are, Maria said. The fact that you held out at all, that you made them work for every piece of information, shows incredible courage. But Sarah was shaking her head, tears now flowing freely down her face. People could die because of what I told them. My teammates, other soldiers. How do I live with that? It was the question that Maria had been dreading, because she knew there was no easy answer. The reality of warfare was that sometimes good people were put in impossible situations where any choice they made would have terrible consequences. Sarah was going to have to find a way to live with the knowledge that her breaking under torture might have cost lives, even though she had no real control over what happened once her mental defenses were systematically destroyed. You live with it by understanding that you did everything humanly possible, Maria said, and by making sure that the sacrifice you made wasn't in vain. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of boots in the corridor announced the arrival of others who had heard the screaming. Agent Coleman appeared in the doorway, followed by Colonel Williams and Dr. Wright. All three men took in the scene. Sarah's obvious distress, her tears, and the fact that she was clearly in a more lucid state than they had seen her in since a rescue. Lieutenant Mitchell, Coleman said, stepping forward with what Maria recognized as barely contained excitement. I can see that you're beginning to remember. This is exactly what we've been waiting for. Maria moved protectively between Sarah and the intelligence officer. She's just had a severe flashback. She needs time to process what she's remembering before you start asking questions. Staff Sergeant, with respect, we don't have the luxury of time, Coleman replied. If Lieutenant Mitchell is beginning to recover her memories of her captivity, we need to debrief her immediately while the details are fresh. Sarah was watching this exchange with growing agitation. The presence of multiple authority figures, combined with the traumatic memories she had just relived, was clearly triggering her defensive responses again. I remember, Sarah said suddenly, her voice cutting through the argument. Everyone in the room turned to look at her. I remember what they wanted to know, and I remember what I told them. Coleman pulled out his ever-present recording device, but Maria held up a hand to stop him. "If she's going to do this, it's going to be on her terms," Maria declared. "No recordings, no pressure, no interrogation techniques. She talks when she's ready, and she stops when she's had enough." Colonel Williams nodded. "Agreed." Agent Coleman, put the recorder away. Lieutenant Mitchell, take your time and tell us what you're comfortable sharing. Sarah looked around the room at the faces surrounding her. Some sympathetic, some impatient, all waiting for her to reveal secrets that had cost her nearly everything to protect. She straightened slightly, and for a moment, Maria caught a glimpse of the professional warrior Sarah had been before her capture. Operation Neptune was a deep reconnaissance mission, Sarah began, her voice gaining strength as she found her professional footing. "My team was inserted into Taliban-controlled territory to map tunnel systems and identify supply routes being used to move weapons and personnel." She paused, clearly struggling with the next part of her account. Maria reached out and took her hand, offering silent support. "We were compromised on the third day," Sarah continued. "Someone in the village we were observing must have spotted us and reported our position. They hit us during a shift change when our guard was down." Coleman leaned forward. "How many of your team members were captured?" Sarah's face went pale. I was separated from the others during the initial attack. I don't know what happened to them." Her voice broke slightly. "I've been hoping they made it out, but if they didn't—" "Your team made it back to base," Colonel Williams said gently. "All of them. They reported you as missing in action and requested immediate search and rescue operations." The relief that washed over Sarah's face was profound. Maria could see some of the guilt and self-recrimination that had been eating at her begin to fade as she learned that her teammates had survived. "Thank God," Sarah whispered. I was so afraid that my capture had gotten them killed." "Now," Coleman said, his voice taking on a more urgent tone, "we need to know exactly what information you gave your captors about the tunnel systems and supply routes." Sarah's expression hardened as she forced herself to confront the memories she had been avoiding. They used enhanced interrogation techniques, sleep deprivation, temperature extremes, stress positions, and drugs. Lots of drugs that made it hard to think clearly. She was quiet for a long moment, and Maria could see her struggling to organize memories that were fragmented and traumatic. "I held out for, I think it was about 2 weeks," Sarah said finally. "But they were professionals. They knew exactly how to break down my resistance systematically. By the end, I would have told them anything to make it stop." "What specifically did you reveal about Operation Neptune?" Dr. Wright asked, pulling out a notepad. Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember. "The locations of the main tunnel entrances we had identified, the approximate size and capacity of the network, the names of villages that we suspected were being used as supply depots." She opened her eyes and looked directly at Coleman. "Everything. I told them everything I knew." The room fell silent as the implications of her confession sank in. Maria could see Coleman and Dr. Wright exchanging glances, clearly processing the intelligence value of what Sarah had revealed and what countermeasures would need to be taken. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice becoming smaller. "Something worse." Maria felt her stomach drop. She could see that Sarah was about to reveal something that she considered even more damaging than the operational intelligence she had already disclosed. "They knew things about me," Sarah continued. "Personal things. They knew about David, about how he died. They knew about my family back home. They used that information to make me more cooperative." The implication was clear. Sarah's captors hadn't just tortured her physically and psychologically. They had also exploited her personal vulnerabilities and grief to break down her resistance. It was a level of cruelty that went beyond what most people could imagine. "They made me choose," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said they would kill other prisoners, people from nearby villages who had helped American forces, unless I cooperated. They showed me photos, videos of families with children. Maria felt tears building in her own eyes as she began to understand the full scope of what Sarah had endured. It wasn't just torture in the traditional sense. It was a systematic psychological campaign designed to destroy everything she valued about herself and her service. "So I talked," Sarah said simply. "I told them what they wanted to know because I couldn't live with the thought of innocent people dying because of my silence." Agent Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "Lieutenant, you need to understand that we have no way of verifying whether those threats were real. It's possible that your captors were simply using psychological manipulation to—" "It doesn't matter," Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining strength again. "Real or not, I believe them. And I made my choice based on what I thought was right at the time." Maria squeezed Sarah's hand. "You made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. No one can fault you for trying to save innocent lives." Colonel Williams nodded in agreement. "Lieutenant Mitchell, what you've told us today takes tremendous courage. The information you provided will help us adjust our operations and protect other personnel who might be operating in those areas." Sarah looked around the room at the faces surrounding her. "So what happens now?" "Court-martial for giving aid and comfort to the enemy." "Nothing like that," Colonel Williams assured her. "What happened to you was a consequence of your service, not a failure of character. You'll be recommended for medical retirement with full honors and all the support services you need to continue your recovery." Maria could see that Sarah was emotionally exhausted from reliving her ordeal. The woman who had finally found the courage to confront her darkest memories needed time to process what she had revealed and what it meant for her future. "I think that's enough for today," Maria said firmly. "Lieutenant Mitchell needs rest." As the others filed out of the room, Maria remained behind with Sarah. The woman was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands with the expression of someone who had just climbed out of a very deep, dark hole. "How do you feel?" Maria asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Lighter, somehow. Like I've been carrying something heavy for so long that I forgot what it felt like to stand up straight." "Secrets are like that," Maria observed. "The longer you carry them, the heavier they get." Sarah looked up at her with eyes that, while still haunted, held a clarity that had been missing since the day they found her in that Afghan village. "I keep thinking about David," Sarah said, "about how he came back from his deployment carrying secrets he never talked about. Things he saw, things he did, things that happened to him. I wonder if talking about it might have helped in the way talking about it helped me today." Maria felt her throat tighten as she thought about her brother Miguel, who had also carried invisible wounds that had ultimately proven fatal. "Maybe. We'll never know for sure. But I think he would be proud of you for finding the courage to face your demons." Sarah nodded slowly. "I want to go home, Maria. I want to see my parents, visit David's grave, try to figure out what normal life looks like again. But I'm scared that I'll never really be able to leave this place behind." "You don't have to leave it behind completely," Maria said. "What happened to you here is part of who you are now. The key is learning to carry it without letting it define everything else about your life." Over the following days, Sarah continued to recover her memories and work through the trauma of her captivity. Agent Coleman conducted several more debriefing sessions, but they were done with Maria present and with Sarah setting the pace. The woman who had been found broken and silent in that remote village was gradually reclaiming her voice and her strength. 2 weeks later, Maria stood on the tarmac watching as Sarah boarded the transport plane that would take her back to the United States and the next phase of her recovery. The woman walking up those aircraft steps bore little resemblance to the broken figure they had rescued 6 weeks earlier. She moved with purpose and confidence, and when she turned to wave goodbye, her smile was genuine rather than forced. "You saved her life," Lieutenant Colonel Morrison said, coming to stand beside Maria as the plane taxied toward the runway. "We all saved her life," Maria replied. "She just needed people who were willing to fight for her when she couldn't fight for herself." As the plane disappeared into the Afghan sky, carrying Sarah Mitchell home to the life she had nearly lost, Maria felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had kept the promise she made to herself the day they found Sarah, to ensure that this wounded warrior received the care and respect she deserved. But more than that, Maria had learned something important about the true meaning of service. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons against foreign enemies, but with compassion and determination against the invisible wounds that war inflicted on those who served. Sometimes the greatest victory was simply helping a fellow warrior find her way back home, not just geographically, but emotionally and spiritually. Sarah Mitchell would face many challenges in the months and years ahead as she worked to rebuild her life after trauma. But she would face them with the knowledge that she was not alone, that there were people who understood her struggle and who would continue to fight for her recovery. And in a small medical facility in Afghanistan, Maria Santos would continue her own mission, ensuring that every wounded warrior who came through her doors received not just medical treatment, but the human connection and advocacy they needed to heal completely. Because sometimes, Maria had learned, the most important medicine was simply refusing to give up on someone, even when they had given up on themselves.